Hey everybody, Dr. Boyce Clark, CEO and founder of Lubricity Labs. Happy Thursday. Sorry for the delay. I accidentally went live on my personal Facebook account a few minutes ago instead of the Lubricity one, so technical difficulties. Sorry about that. Today we're going to talk about the science of gray hair, which is really interesting stuff. So scientifically, going gray is defined as a decline in the size and the distribution of melanin in your hair. Melanin is the pigment that gives our skin the color and our hair its color. And size and distribution obviously means the size of the molecule, and the distribution means how many of those molecules per certain unit of your hair. So a decline in this over time is defined as graying of your hair. Pigment in our hair gets formed when the hair itself gets formed in the dermis. So in your scalp, we have live cells that are incorporating melanin in it through pigmentation, and then they die through a process called keratinization, and that's where we form keratin and actually make the strong protein that's in our hair, and it grows out, and the melanin is trapped in there. So the color is then trapped in our hair. The color of our hair is dependent on how many of these melanocytes, the cells that make melanin, are present adding color to the hair, and how big these molecules are that they go. So very similar to the way our skin color is based on the size and the amount of melanin that we have in our skin, our hair color is also based on this. Before I start this, let me preface it by saying the science of going gray is not fully understood, because as we grow older, the vast majority of us will go gray, yet we don't have graying skin with age, so we're not really sure why that is, because the processes are very similar. But I will talk about what we do know about the science of graying hair. So as we age, less melanin goes into the hair, and the molecules generally get smaller. And this causes the hair to have a loss of pigment in it. There's a huge study done in the 90s, both in Scandinavia and Australia, with over 13,000 subjects that looked at a large number of people and tried to study this graying. So what we know about it is it begins on the temples, it then moves to the crown of the vortex, and it then finishes at the back of the occipital part of your head. So in all people, it progresses in that manner. The study showed that there's no difference in the onset or the progression of graying in men or women. So we all get it equally. What was really interesting from the study is the onset and progression of graying based on your racial descent. So if you are of Caucasian descent, on average, graying will begin. So it's important that I clarify that I'm saying beginning graying, not going gray, but beginning to have graying. That if you're of Caucasian descent, this is going to happen in your mid-30s. If you're of Asian descent, it on average happens in your late 30s, and if you're of African descent, it on average happens in your mid-40s. So this makes sense if you think about that graying is a function of how much melanin and the size of the melanin in your hair versus ethnicities. Because if you're of African descent, you have more melanin in your skin and more melanin in your hair, so you have more of it to start with. Whereas if you're of Caucasian descent, you have less of it to start with, so when it runs out, it's going to be happening sooner than that. So it's very interesting to look at the onset of that on age. These studies talk about what's called the perception of gray. So when you think about that, if you're someone who's got naturally black hair and you get a few gray hairs, they're going to be very obvious for the contrast. So you're going to see them a lot sooner than if you're a natural blonde and you start developing gray, you're not going to see it as soon. So this was problematic in the study for the perception of gray. But it's important to think about this as a gradual process, and again, the pattern in which it follows. So we talked about the melanocytes. They're the ones that add melanin to your hair. The studies show that these melanocytes reproduce or reseed themselves 7 to 15 times over your lifetime. And they live for a certain amount of time. And that's why the age that we talked about is mid-30s, late 30s to mid-40s is happening because that's when they've cycled out. So people of African descent have more of them, so it takes longer for them to cycle out. But there's some things that the studies show that can accelerate graying. a very well-known study talks about that three things are generally expected to accelerate aging, and that is going to be radiation, i.e. sunlight exposure, inflammation, which now we know is really probably the cause of lots of pathology and lots of disease in our body. When we're in an inflamed state, things don't function properly. So the death of these melanocytes during states of high inflammation is logical. And then the third is psycho-emotional stress. Again, this is not very well understood, but these things all tend to have a common link to early onset graying. So if we can suppress any of these, we can theoretically delay graying. It's inevitable though, so we want to definitely talk about how to manage it. So the other studies, lots of people have written in and talked to us about their gray hair, and they'll say things like, I had beautiful hair when I was younger. Now that it's gray, it has a yellow tinge to it. Now that I have gray hair, it's wiry and insane and it goes crazy. I can't control it. Or I only have a few gray hairs and the rest of my hair is really good, but these grays are the ones that are out of control and they're wiry and they go all over the place. Let's talk about why that is. So studies show that from a molecular level, gray hair versus pigmented hair, there's no difference except the lack of pigment. So gray hair doesn't have a different curl pattern. It doesn't have more damage to it. It's really identical to pigmented hair, just it doesn't have pigment in it. The issue is, and this is so interesting, that is as your hair grows out, the pigment that you used to have in your hair protected your hair from ultraviolet radiation. So the radiation step, the exposure to the sun, just like it damages your skin, it damages your hair. Just like melanin protects our skin, a sun tan will protect you from damage. The melanin in our hair protects our hair from damage. So when our hair is gray, we no longer have that protection from photo damage. So what the studies show is that the UV radiation comes in, and last week we talked about cysteine bonds. Those are the disulfide bonds that give strength to our hair, that when you do things like color your hair, you could break these bonds. When you do things like straightening your hair, perming your hair, you break these bonds and then attempt to put them back together. But UV radiation will actually break the bonds also. Once it breaks them, it changes the cysteine to another amino acid called tryptophan. Tryptophan has a yellow color to it. So if you've got hair with no pigment in it that now has lots of tryptophan, the appearance to our eye is of yellow. So that's why graying hair will have a yellow tinge to it in many cases, is because the sun is damaging the hair. It's also breaking the bonds, it's ripping the cuticle layer off, it's making your hair less hydrophobic, which is water repelling, which we want, and it's making your hair more hydrophilic, which is water loving and making it absorb water. Absorbing water into your hair is a bad thing. The hair swells, you have structural damage and breakage. Water is not your friend for your hair. So it's interesting to think about that your gray hair is growing out. It's completely the same as your other hair until we expose it to UV radiation and sunlight all during the days, and the damage is occurring then. That's why if you're someone that has mostly pigmented hair but a few wild grays, they're wild because the sunlight is damaging them and breaking those bonds and making the curl pattern be insane. Damaged cuticle, wiriness, dryness, the fact that it's going to swell when it gets wet, the increased hydrophilicity, reduced hydrophobicity. These are all things that are happening because of sunlight damage to your hair. So again, the yellow is coming because the sunlight is hitting your hair and breaking one amino acid and turning it into another one that has a yellow color. So interesting stuff to think about, that gray hair, if we didn't have sun damage to it, would be also as luxurious as your regular hair, just without the pigment to it. So if anyone has any questions, please feel free to submit them to us. I'll be glad to answer them if they come up right now, or if I don't get to them, we'll certainly respond to you and talk about it. But in the announcement, I wanted to say that we have an upcoming big announcement next week with regard to this subject. Today was just kind of a primer on explaining to you why your hair turns gray, and if you are plagued with wiry, wild gray hair, why that's happening, because it's occurring from the sunlight damaging this molecular structure of your hair. But next week, we're going to have a very big announcement with regard to this subject and some things that Lubricity is doing to address it. So I think we have a question coming through. But as someone who's recently been dealing with gray hair, again, I'm getting mine starting on the temples, and I'm sure it's going to make its way through. I'm trying to embrace it, but I get it. So it's interesting that that's a very common question that we get from people is, what about grays? What can the product do for gray hair? Why is it that the grays are always the wild ones that everyone sees and the things that are all out all over the place? And I hope this kind of answered that. But we do have a question coming through. Let me read it. If you color your hair, does that help protect against sun damage? Absolutely. So these studies show that even hair dye adds protection to it because the dye itself is going to absorb the UV radiation and absorb it and not allow the hair to absorb it, which is what happens when the bonds get broken and damaged. So yes, these studies show that artificially colored hair has less damage to it than gray hair. So if you're one of those people that's thinking, I'm not ever going to dye my hair because I think it's a bad idea or whatever, if you're someone who's got wild hair that's being caused by the damage from the sun, having some color added to it may actually help with that. And I'm not a cosmetologist, so let me disclaim that. I'm not advising anyone to color or not color, but these studies certainly show that having pigment in your hair, whether it's natural or artificial, protects the hair against that. Okay, well, any other questions, please feel free to submit them and we will address them. And please stay tuned next week when we announce our big announcements with regard to the subject that we talked about today. Thank you guys so much, and I really appreciate the love and always the comments, and certainly our Lubricity family. So thanks a lot, and you guys have a great rest of your Thursday. Thanks. Bye.